This would have been inconceivable. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, Guy Fawkes and the gunpowder plot, I mean, that was like 500 years ago. And, children in England still sing rhymes about that. And that bomb didn't even go off.
This is our new daily feature, What If, where we explore the political parallel universes Britain could have enjoyed or suffered had things gone a little bit differently. Today we ask, what if this had turned out just a few metres the other way?
Mrs. Thatcher is more respected than liked, and that respect was reinforced for many, including opponents, following the bombing of the Brighton hotel in which she and the cabinet were staying for the 1984 party conference. 5 were killed in the attack, which was claimed by the outlawed IRA organisation. The Prime Minister herself only narrowly escaped injury.
You hear about these atrocities, these bombs. You don't expect them to happen to you.
Yes, it's one of the biggest questions of the 1980s and one of the most decisive moments in British politics. What if Margaret Thatcher had not survived the bombing of the Grand Hotel in Brighton in 1984 by the Provisional IRA? Joining me to discuss this is Rory O'Carroll, who you've heard on this show before. He's the author of a new book, Killing Thatcher, the IRA, the Manhunt and the Long War on the Crown. Afternoon, Rory.
Hi, good afternoon, Patrick. Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Reading your book, Rory, it's clear that the IRA did indeed come very close to killing Mrs. Thatcher. If she hadn't gone to the bathroom, working on her red boxes really, really late into the night, as was her wont, had the chimney stacks of the hotel fallen a different way, we might have been talking now about the first successful assassination of a prime minister since Spencer Perceval in 1812.
Indeed. I mean, she could have been entombed in the bathroom or in the armchair that she was sitting in when the bomb did detonate. I mean, that's how close they came. And yes, I mean, we'd be living in a different world.
First things first, what do you think the immediate reaction from Britain and Ireland is in the wake of a successful attack? Because it's such a, as you say, they come so close. Is there immediately a very punitive reaction from the British government on the island of Ireland?
Certainly, well, clearly would have been a massively shocking, seminal event in these islands. The IRA certainly were braced for a major backlash. The senior leadership that knew in advance of the attack went to ground in advance of it in anticipation of a whirlwind of a response. They were thinking the security forces, if she's killed or even if she survives, but there could well be a massive crackdown, possibly a repeat of internment, possibly hundreds, if not thousands, of Republican suspects swept up and put in jail without charge. So they were braced for that. And in some levels, they wanted that because often, if Britain, from an Irish perspective, are seen to kind of overreact to something, this would then actually benefit the IRA to act as a recruiting sergeant. So they were braced for that and wanted it in a way.
Yeah, it's a sort of very, well, as we saw, a very audacious bid for, a propaganda victory as much as anything else. Despite the, just how, it's almost unconscionable, the idea of the entire cabinet and a prime minister, as you write in the book, being assassinated on British soil. It almost sort of defies our comprehension of what is possible in British politics. Indeed, it turned out not to be the case. But in your book, you write that the day after Willie Whitelaw, Mrs. Thatcher's trusted right-hand man, would have been put in as caretaker prime minister. But who do you think might have succeeded her for good? It could have changed the trajectory of the Conservative Party and with it Britain in the 1980s.
It could well have done, because I mean, this would have been inconceivable. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, Guy Fawkes and the gunpowder plot, I mean, that was like 500 years ago. And, children in England still sing rhymes about that. And that bomb didn't even go off. I mean, in Brighton, the bomb went off. Okay, Thatcher survived. But I mean, had she died? I mean, yes, Willie Whitelaw would have been left to try to pick up the pieces. And I mean, he would have acted as a caretaker prime minister. And the likelihood is there would have been a swift election within the Conservative Party for a new party leader, and thereby a new prime minister. Now, who might that have been? One possibility, Norman Tebbit. I mean, he, of course, was severely injured in the attack, but I mean, he came back within 3 months, despite grievous injuries, which he partially concealed. He was back and retook his ministerial portfolio. So it's conceivable that, he would have, he's seen as kind of the torchbearer for Thatcherism, more Thatcherite than Thatcher. And that could well have been a backlash and a desire for him to, in a show of defiance, to the IRA, and to show that Thatcherism was alive and well. So possibly the party could have rallied around him. It's also conceivable Cecil Parkinson, who just a year earlier had been disgraced and had to resign from the cabinet, given this completely kind of scrambled political calculus. He could have made a comeback, maybe, or Michael Heseltine, could finally have swung into the hot seat on this. So it's also conceivable that the Wets, might have staged a comeback of sorts. That would have been the shock in the Tory party, that they would have gone for a kind of a more kind of mainstream figure, and thereby, the kind of drained some of the momentum from Thatcherism, because there we had, the privatization was just really beginning to take off, but it was still uncertain what the outcome was. This experiment going to work or not? So and then not to mention the Cold War could have been different, because just in the aftermath of Brighton and Thatcher's survival, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was then just a rising member of the Politburo, accepted belatedly an invitation to come to visit Margaret Thatcher in England. And up until that point, he'd been snubbing her, but it appears that, kind of somewhat impressed by her survival and her response, he then turned up at Chequers just a few months later in December of 1984. And there was this, I think it's not over-egging it to say, kind of an epochal meeting between Margaret Thatcher and Mikhail Gorbachev, where she sensed and famously said this was a man we could do business with. And she was so exhilarated by this prospect, she flew to Camp David to sit down with Ronald Reagan and said, look, there's change afoot. This guy, Gorbachev, he's, there's some historic opening here. And Reagan initially was very skeptical, but she kind of forged a path for what eventually became, this détente between Washington and Moscow. Now, had she died, would any of that have happened? It may well have happened anyway, but we don't know.
Yeah, it's remarkable. The reverberations of that night felt well beyond Brighton and Westminster. Rory O'Carroll, author of Killing Thatcher, The IRA, The Manhunt and The Long War on the Crown. Thanks very much for joining us for today's Counterfactual. Remember, we'll be doing one of these every day. I'm in the presenter's chair. And today we were asking, what if the Thatcher had not escaped the bombing of the Grand Hotel in Brighton in 1984, which, of course, claimed the lives of several Tory officials and MPs. Very narrow escape Mrs Thatcher had, and it really would have changed the course of British history, as Rory was saying there. And his book is very good indeed, very gripping, worth checking out.